All right, boys. Guess what time it is? It's time to cook. Yo, guys, what's up? So, as the professional degenerate that I am, I spent a lot of today grinding out and building a drafting sheet for this upcoming series between T1 and Weibo. The point of the sheet is to kind of give a highlight as to a lot of the special drafting combinations that could really go on between these two teams, as both teams have very distinct styles going in, and combined with a meta shift that has caused a lot of problems. And we probably have one of the most diverse sort of drafting scenarios in a long time, I would say, at Worlds. I would say up until about last week, the Worlds meta was pretty solved, almost. But with the onslaught of these range supports, as well as just all the diversity that's coming on from especially the bottom side of the map, it's been really hard to get a proper read as to what's good anymore. And it's very confusing because now what was an original priority of, oh, I'll pick this in the slot and then this leads into this chain, there's actually several strategies that are now available, and it makes it very hard for both teams, I would imagine, to really understand what is happening, but also deciding what trades they're going to make and what things they should prepare in order to compensate for some of their weaknesses or compensate for some things that they can't address in draft, right? That is kind of the idea behind preparing for draft. It is understanding what flaws your teams has, what strengths they have, and then what you can do to adapt, not only between things that you can't prepare for in draft, so let's say you don't have enough bans for it, or just something you just don't feel like you normally can address, or cooking something up and preparing different things so that you can adapt from game to game, right? That's the point of this sheet. So I'll give it to her. So this is the entire sheet. I'm going to share it in the description as well. There's a few tabs that goes on with it, and it's supposed to give a snapshot of everything that's going on. It's not supposed to be the be all end all. This is not the complete draft plans from both teams, obviously, because I'm just a guy, and this is not supposed to be a leak into their intentions of what they should be banning, right? It's just like an exploration of what they could be picking and what options they have, and just to kind of highlight why it's so confusing, right? So on the first tab here, I have the pools of both T1 and Weibo, as well as every champion that has been picked at World so far. There's been a lot of champions. I believe up to this point it's around 87 of them. But however, a lot of these are really random tech picks from certain players, and some of them are not going to be relevant. So I would say the common pool of champions now is around, I would say, 25 to 30. Maybe a little bit more, right? Some interesting things to note are that apparently Faker's only played 3 champions this entire event. So he's been basically a 2-trick with the Orion and Azir, and has played 2 Sylas games. But both of the times that he picked Sylas, it didn't look that ideal. So I would basically consider it a 2-trick. That's the one thing I would note. And as well, there's a bit of like there's a couple of disparities in terms of what these teams ban and what they prioritize as well. So like, for example, the Shy is more of like a weak side player, but then Zeus has more tech picks for certain scenarios, and we'll dive into more of it later, right? I also have the notes on things to keep out for, I would say, if I were in the perspective of both teams. Also keep in mind that it is hard for something like this to be fully effective when you're looking overall and not from a perspective of one of the teams but both of them, because it's kind of the idea of like playing chess against yourself. And if you've ever tried that for whatever reason, it's actually kind of really hard. So in the second tab, we also have explored the average, the match history of the games of all the games that both of these teams have played at Worlds in the main stage, as well as against their opponents. And I did it from most recent to latest, or to furthest away, just to get the most recent information, because obviously these later games, they're going to have a different meta. And as the meta evolves, you kind of want to take these picks with a grain of salt, depending on what they are, right? And at the bottom here, you're going to take a look at the average pick phase, which is an interesting statistic because it encapsulates who is typically biting the bullet in the earlier phases and who's reserving resources for later phases. So key things to note here: big discrepancy between Faker's pick phase versus Xiaohu's, as an example. Faker's pretty much always going to be picking within the first 3 in the first phase because he can play Orianna Azir. Both of these champions are okay to basically any comp and any matchup, so they're at least in this meta. So it's not really that big of a concern for him. It's the same with you're going to see the same a lot with jungle, right? Because all the good jungle champs in Worlds this year are all like these, or all of these like meatball champs that don't really that also just work into most comps. There's very little variance, I would say, and this has come off the bat of, let's take a look. You have your Jarvans, your Maokais, your Rels, Vi, Poppy, and such, and maybe a little bit of Lee Sin and a couple of tech picks here and there, but that is pretty much the meta. All champions that are, for the most part, really blindable. The only counter-pickable ones, or let's say situational ones, are probably Vi and Lee Sin, depending on the champions that are available, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Jungle will be blinded often. I think the other thing to keep in mind is whether or not Weibo will actually sign up for these Azir Orianna trades, or will they actually lean into the fact that Xiaohu has played plenty of champions in the world's main stage and will maybe can try to do something else. So I'll talk about a little bit more about that later. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of the average pick phase is that both supports are pretty late in the draft, and this is normal for this meta because support counterpick, or balling counterpick in general, and especially support counterpick, is very important in this series. The reason for this is because, as you can see, pretty much every style of support, a little dash of it here and there, is actually super viable. And because of that, and because the pool is so wide, this is not something that's fixable by bans per se. This is something that needs to be resolved with counterpick. And therefore, keeping an eye out for these potential counterpicks from a lot of these players is going to be very important. The thing that circumvents this is the range support meta that guarantees push into any matchup, which does cause problems and is another area where both teams will have to trade for. This is something that, again, we're just exploring into and not necessarily deciding that a team should be doing it or not. But there are options here, and these are things for both of the teams to consider. The only other thing I touch on is with top. Both of the top laners have, I would say, relatively similar pools with a couple of creative picks to deal with certain things, right? So we have the Gragas and Yone. I would consider the Gragas as well for Zeus, as well as like we've seen the Graves top into the Aatrox, as well as the Quinn, right? So I think the main thing with top is preventing specifically the Shy from having to deal with picks that are good in a vacuum and have no bad matchups. This is why you see a very high ban percentage of things like Jax, and potentially something as well, the Rumble coming up. Even though the Shy does play Rumble, it's probably just going to be something that's going to be either pick or ban throughout the entire series in the first phase, and it's not ever going to go past, I would say, like something like R2 or B2, B3. That is the latest I would ever see it go, I would say. So that is something to keep in mind. So let's see if there's anything out of this. That is pretty much everything to consider. So with that in mind, we can talk about some examples of it. So in the first sheet that I have here, this is pretty much a sample of what teams go through in terms of scenario planning for a lot of their games on stage. Pretty much most professional teams have decided that this is the format to go for right now. I do think that it's not perfect, and I feel like there's at least from what I feel like, there is a more efficient way of planning out drafts, because effectively this is just a giant flowchart of 10,000 scenarios, and it is just on your coach to remember that, and then using intuition whenever something doesn't go according to plan, because it's very possible that you plan for 10,000 scenarios and then scenario 10,001 happens and then you don't know what to do. So I digress. We can take a bit of time to explore, and something to keep in mind is that, again, I have not explored every single option because that takes a lot of time, and I am not employed by T1 or Weibo. So yeah, I'm just doing it for fun. So I don't have enough time for this shit, is what I'm saying. So I got blue side and red side pretty much. So situations where T1 is blue and situations where T1 is red. and Weibo would be vice versa, right? So we can start off with the most common potential bans. I've listed out some of them here. The most common bans that I think are going to be happening are listed here. So there's a lot of the main thing to keep in mind are the oppressive ADCs plus things like the Rumble for the side against T1. So that's why I think things like the Ashe are going to be very big problems. Caitlyn is something that's always been a problem against T1, but it could be on Weibo to make a decision whether to play against it or not. It's totally on them. So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to whether they want to opt into certain trades. So this is just an example. This is not saying Weibo should do this. This is one of the things Weibo could do in order to prepare a ban situation against T1. And it's same with T1 into Weibo, right? So it's very common for, I would say the most common and popular opener that's going to be very standard for Weibo is probably going to be allowing T1 to simply take Orianna B1. The bans are, I would say the bans are pretty hard locked for Weibo on red side for the most part, at least from my perspective, because Rumble is going to be very hard for them to deal with unless they want to take it on R1, R2, and then they can just let it go. But things like the Caitlyn and the Ashe are going to be very hard for them, I would say, in most scenarios, right? Or they can get rid of these champions just to remove the potential for trades of these like Caitlyn Kalista versus various Ashe lanes, right? Which I've mentioned actually right here. So it really does depend on the dynamic that these teams want to go for. Weibo can opt out of this lane, this style of lane rather, if they want to, but they can also force it to happen if they want to, right? So let's talk about this first row first. They B1 Orianna, and then they would, most of the time, Weibo would probably match with a jungle R2 or I tested it with Aphelios. With the Aphelios chain, it didn't really end up working out so well because T1 would probably go for a standard opener like this with Orianna, Poppy, Aatrox, and it doesn't end up working. I would say it works out pretty well for them actually with the Azir on 3. The only issue is that the Azir on 3 is premeditated, and I've noted it here because when you show this and you know that you have to trade Azir on 3 for Orianna, or you have to trade Azir for Orianna eventually, you basically give T1 a free R3 pick in the form of a B3. The reason this is because T1 is already aware that your Azir is going to be picked R3. Think of it like, let's say, Caitlyn Lux is something that you have to pick, or Lucian Nami. It's the same thing. And sometimes teams will either pick Lucian Nami on R1, R2, or they can stagger it and pick, let's say, just Lucian plus a priority pick on R2, and then they just preemptively lock in their Nami pick for R3 without even showing it per se. So that is something sometimes teams do, but it does show 3 picks for the price of 2 effectively, right? Because these bot lane pairings want to be shown at once. So the alternative to this is to simply match Azir instantly and then pick Poppy, or pick the jungler of choice, right? Rel would also work here if Weibo decides to want that instead, but I feel like the Azir Poppy is a really good 1-2 combo, because it begins the impenetrable fortress per se. And when you play this out, and depending on what T1 can match out with, in this case I just plugged in Rel and Aatrox, which is something they would do, then it actually gives a decent situation for Weibo to come out ahead in draft, because they have R3, they can match top with leaning into the pool of the Shy. We've seen that he has some really interesting picks into blind pick abusers. So he had the Graves into the Aatrox and things, and the Quinn into the Jax, which is a little bit less successful, but you know what I mean. He's got something cooking. So either Weibo can lean onto this, or they can push him even further, and he can cook up something even heavier, right? We have champs that have not been seen at Worlds, right? We've seen 87 champs at Worlds, but that doesn't mean that teams aren't trying more champs. That's the thing, right? Who knows what they're going to go for, to be honest with you. Like you have all these top laners. You could go Jace, you can go other champions. We could bring, who knows, maybe they could be testing Fiora again. It's really dependent on what they think is going to work, and we don't really know that. And who knows, like it's the world final, right? It's having picks to catch people off guard is basically what it's going to be about, because when you do something like that, you're throwing this draft plan out the window, right? You're throwing the enemy's draft plan out the window. They have to think on their feet. So that's the idea behind that. Anyways, with this opener, it seems the most consistent possible because the best B1 that T1 would go for is Orianna, and then they can just match. So on paper, they get like an even game state, slightly advantaged because they get counter pick on top side, and they get priority picks and match, blah 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 blah. So another interesting dynamic I thought about was actually banning both Azir and Orianna. This is another version of draft where you can draft according to the way you force the game state to play around. So let's say Weibo ban Azir, Orianna, and Jarvan, right? The reason for this is because, as you mentioned, Faker has only played 3 champs, basically 2 champs. I'm not doubting that Faker can play more than 2 champs, but according to what they've been practicing on stage and the way they've been playing, it seems like they've only been used to the primary control mages and just playing through a similar style that way, and just having Faker play out this matchup and play out that mid lane dynamic. But Xiaohu has other champions he can lean on to cause some chaos around the map. I'm looking at things like the Sylas, the Ahri, the Talia, even the Jace sometimes, right? And this leans into the dynamic that these bans enable, which is the shit show of full bottom lane AD carry nonsense, right? And when you have a bottom lane that's so volatile and so dependent on having pressure in the early game, having mid laners that can move around the map and create timers and don't mind doing so can be beneficial. The Jarvan ban is to also supplement this, just to throw it in there, because when you're banning both of these, this basically means all the AD carries are going to be up, and it's going to be a little bit hard for Varus Ashe to breathe if they first pick J4. So I just put it in there because I thought it was okay. So we play it out. I just put T1 ban Kalista, play out Kalista. Then Weibo can go Varus Ashe, and then T1 matches Kayle and Kalista, and they actually go Wukong, and then they match Maokai. So it's like an okay scenario. But if they want to be more volatile, right? I think this is probably one of the better options. They can trade this matchup if they wanted to, but again, this is like a different way of forcing the draft to be different. So the way this entirely plays out, Weibo would probably have, I would slightly favor this bot lane matchup to Weibo, so it's not actually too bad. Then they're basically focused on building as much presence as possible and leaning into Xiaohu's 4th pick on 4 and then getting counter pick on 5. And they could probably get ahead on drafting this, right? But knowing T1, there's a lot of things they can just bust out to make this a lot harder for them. And who knows what if they're banning out all of these champs, all 3 of the champs that Faker has busted out in Worlds, he's for sure going to pick a new champ. And if this is the case, Weibo will have to be ready for something different. And like if they're not prepared for what Faker would be willing to pull out, then that is something to keep in mind. Another option is they ban just Orianna, and if they let, this is another option, right? They just ban Orianna, and then they make T1 trade between priority picks, right? So in this case, it's Ashe, Caitlyn, Orianna. You have J4 that can be, oh sorry, J4 is banned in this case, but let's say for example it's not banned, you can let J4 be open here if they wanted to, or if they go for a Kalista opener, they could go for you have Rumble that's available, you have Azir, like there's a lot of things they're trading for. So if you'd isolate just enough picks to make it so that you get 2 of them and T1 gets 1 of them, that is a good way to start off your draft, right? Another version of this is with letting Ashe through, and this is why I determined that the Ashe ban was probably pretty necessary for at least for Weibo on red for most of the time, because with every Ashe opener that I thought of, it felt pretty losing for Weibo. If you go Ashe, it's going to be a flux between both AD and support, so it doesn't matter what you ban if you let Ashe through. The best you can pick with these hypothetical bans is Kalista Renata, but then you can go Ashe Varus, which I would say is favored. Then they get Ashe Varus Azir, which is like the beginning of the impenetrable fortress, because now owner could lock in anything on 4 and you just pick Zeus something neutralizing on 5, or even potentially countering. Then it's like really hard for Weibo to play the game. You know, you can even pick like Orin here, and it would be quite easy for them to execute on fights. Or even Jace. Like if you go Jace Poppy here, let's say Poppy's up for whatever reason. If you go Jace Poppy, you got the turbo poke comp with Azir to play the front to back, and Kalista Renata is, I would say, pretty useless after lane. So many combos to think about. And one other element to think about in terms of what your pivots are your conditions, right? So, you know, if one team bans something, you have to match. So that's an option for Weibo. You can match or Azir bans if you wanted to. So let's say T1 bans one of them for whatever reason, or Weibo bans one. It's up to the other team if they want to option into banning it and matching things like Kate Kalista, right? And considering what side you're on, right? So other example conditions. Weibo really like blinding Aphelios a lot. I'm not sure if that's still going to happen because of all the AD carry nonsense, but if they take the route of banning a lot of the AD carries that are lane dominant, this does technically open up the Aphelios opener if they wanted to push up their AD pick and save their priorities for other roles, like leaning into Xiaohu's pool or leaning into Crisp's pool. Because considerably speaking, I would say Light is more okay with blinding for the most part, but that is something to consider, right? The most important things I think here are, like I said, the top lane matchups and who can have more impact, and also having counter pick on bot side. Other than that, it would really depend on what creative picks that teams can have to force win conditions on the other side of the map. So let's say suddenly the Shy is unlocked and he gets to play Fiora again. It's 2018, guys, and he's able to be what he used to be. You know, IG the Shy is back in. Then he shits on the Zeus Aatrox because the matchup's really easy. That could change things, right? That would mean a Fiora ban would be necessary from T1. That would mean Poppy priority goes up. That would mean viability of Aatrox early goes down. Like, we have to make these adjustments. So again, it's the same sort of idea. On the red side, I didn't go into as much depth because there's a lot more options for both teams. So I just gave a couple of examples, but it's sort of like a similar idea. And there's other examples of when teams have to, like, when they don't have bans, they have to cook up new picks to deal with what teams could do, right? So let's say, for example, T1 busts out K-Lux once more. We might have to revive as Karma. So these are all of the options. And this whole sheet is the idea of something to look at while the games are going on. And hopefully you get as excited as I do when looking at this stuff. So I'll leave it for you guys in the comments and in the description. And if you have anything you want to add to it or you want to comment on, I'd love for you guys to give your feedback, because I've been fried looking at this thing and I really need to sleep on it. And I think there's a lot more options that can go into this. So hopefully this was insightful to you guys, and hope you enjoyed this shit. Looking forward to the games. See ya.